Hello and welcome back. In the last episode we started writing our treatment, and in this episode we'll read it back, so for the first time we'll see what our completed story looks like. Let's get started. We're in the writing studio, we're ready to read our completed story. But the first thing I've done is I've changed our topic and our message slightly. As I was writing, I realised that the original topic and message weren't really accurate to the story we were writing, so we've changed those. And I've created a logline. A logline is a one sentence that explains what the story's about, and it's a really good idea to have a logline in your mind as you're writing. A lot of novice writers will kind of change what it's about, or they'll try and add things, or they might just not really know and it ends up being muddled and confused. So it's a really good idea to be able to say in one sentence what your story is about. So for our story, I've said that a man is forced to confront supernatural horrors when his wife vanishes aboard a ghostly train. That's as simple as we can make it, but that's all we need to know. Now for the topic, I've changed it to say, in their search for answers, people can be driven to extraordinary acts by loss and bereavement. So that's what we're going to explore, people losing things or losing people and being driven by this. And the message is to say, when loved ones die, you must let go of them emotionally. If you don't, it will destroy you. So we now know what our story is about. If I bring it down, we can now start reading a little bit of our treatment. So we begin with a prologue. Robert is walking in the night and finds his wife missing from their bed. He hears the front door slam closed and looks through the window to see his wife Rebecca walking into the fields. He rushes down behind her, and as he leaves the house he sees she's being led towards a spectral train by a ghostly little boy. As he tries to chase, he hears growls and barks within the crops, and is prevented from rescuing her by a pack of hellish dogs that appear as silhouettes with a green mist vapour coming from them. He watches as she gets aboard the train and vanishes. So that's quite a nice prologue. It's important with the opening of books to really hook people in and to have something dramatic or some kind of tension. So I think we've got that one. So if we come down onto the stasis, we can say 2 years later, Robert sits in his kitchen looking miserable. Dirty dishes are piled in the sink. His farm manager James comes to talk with him about business, but he doesn't really care. Later that evening, James returns and they have a heart-to-heart over a drink. In their conversation, it is suggested that he tries a medium to see if they can contact Rebecca. This idea offers a way to do something rather than nothing. So Robert visits London to meet a medium and sits in on a séance. He realises it is fake, and after the event quietly exposes the medium and states he's not trying to cause trouble but is merely looking for his wife. He explains the ghost train, and the medium tells him to speak with Cushing, a supernatural investigator who knows of such things. Robert speaks with Cushing, who has chronicled people getting taken by the ghost train, and Cushing knows it comes on the east coastline, but only on a full moon. So now we've got quite a nice stasis. We can see where we are. Now we're ready for a trigger that something's going to happen to drive our story forward. And this begins with two women, Clara and Julia, are asleep in their boarding house. They share a double bed. The ghost boy comes into the room and takes Julia. Her sister Clara awakens and pushes Julia back. The boy takes Clara's hand instead and walks her out. Clara is asking for help, but Julia is too frightened. Once outside, the boy is protected by dogs and Julia can't help. The boy takes Clara to the train. Clara is calling for help, but Julia is too frightened. As the train is vanishing, Clara smashes through a window and lands outside of the train. Julia rushes to her only to see her ghostly soul be ripped from her body and be dragged back to the vanishing train. Clara screams hysterically that her soul has been taken. Robert receives a letter from Cushing, who says there's been a development and asks him to meet in London. Cushing takes him to the sanatorium where Clara is being kept, because he'd wanted to interview Clara for his research, but Julia had refused. So Cushing hopes that when Robert explains that he is looking to find his wife, that Julia will relent and allow Robert to meet the insane Clara. Now, Clara is going to describe being on the train, and she'll describe the little boy and an older distinguished gentleman who told her he was taking her soul to hell. He'd apologised, but said it was now too late. Her soul was taken. That was when she dove at the window and escaped. Clara describes the old man. She describes Isambard and says he wore a ring and a pendant that had a symbol that looked like the letters T and O. So now we've got a trigger. Something has happened to drive our story forward. We have a few clues as well that can lead on to our quest, which begins by saying Julia and Robert revisit Cushing, who identifies the T and O symbols as being from the Temple of Other, a supernatural offshoot of the Freemasons. Robert visits the Temple of Other and is rejected, but he persists almost to the point of violence, while screaming that he is searching for his wife. A man called Sir Michael Stevenson pulls him aside and talks quietly to him. Stevenson and Robert have a heart-to-heart, and Stevenson tells him of the obsidian. He shows him a letter written by the designer of the train, a man called William John Isambard. In his letter, Isambard signalled his intention to commit suicide and destroy the train in the same act. In the letter there is reference to a mechanical heart. Robert asks what this is, and Stevenson brings a wooden box that contains a strange brass compass and an empty space for a heart-shaped device. He explains the purpose of the heart and how Isambard stole it. The heart was given Isambard the chance to step between two worlds, our real world and the world of the dead. Stevenson explains that the heart can be tracked by the compass, but the only way to get it back would be to destroy the train. Seeing Robert's determination, he offers him the compass, and on the condition it is returned, and if he can board and destroy the train, he must return the mechanical heart also. Now we have a discovery. Julia and Robert travel the East Coast train line in the run-up to a full moon, and they watch as the compass needle swings around to face behind them as they're approaching York. So they take horses and they travel back by a horse to a patch of countryside with a farmhouse and suspect this will be where the train next appears. And as they ride around the area, they find the compass always points to the same place. They stay at a local tavern and they discuss what they're afraid of. Julia hates herself for not helping Clara and is frightened as she knows the ghost boy tried to take her first. Robert is afraid of what he might find. He desperately wants to find his wife, but he's terrified of facing the supernatural. On a full moon, they wait by the train line and they hear the approaching whistle. Julia cries out when she sees the ghost boy leading a man through the field as the train appears. Robert sees the train. He sees Isambard as a ghost standing on the back viewing platform. He calls out to him and demands the return of his wife. Isambard apologises but is curt, saying what has been done cannot be reversed. When the ghost boy brings the man, Robert is prevented from helping by the dogs, and Robert realises he could board the train if he wanted to, and he also sees that as Isambard enters the train, the inside is no longer glassy and ethereal, but it's solid and sumptuous. And this brings him to his critical choice. So Robert and Julia return to London and report back to Cushing. Cushing advises against his idea to board the train. He believes that a soul is taken once it steps foot inside. Robert wants to try anyway, and Cushing believes, after hearing that the train looked solid, may be susceptible to a fire or explosion to destroy it. Julia asks Robert not to go. He has his answers and knows his wife will never return, but Robert says the horror must end and is prepared to die trying to bring back his wife. Julia opens up and says she understands his reason, but confesses she cannot bear to see him vanish as well. She says that his wife has gone and it isn't worth gambling with his soul trying to bring her back. She says that maybe he should begin again, that there could be a new life with the living instead of trying to resurrect an old life with the dead. It's a real moment of potential romance, and the offer is made. Robert returns to the Temple of Other and tells Stevenson he's going to board and try to blow up the obsidian. He asks if Stevenson can provide the dynamite for the job. Stevenson will source the dynamite and offers to come with him. He'd also like to see Isambard himself and ask for the return of the heart. Now this brings us to our climax. Robert and Stevenson are about to take the East Coast train when Julia also arrives at the station, insisting that she travel with them. They isolate the position the obsidian will next appear and take horses to rural countryside location. That evening, the train arrives. Stevenson keeps Isambard talking as Robert sneaks aboard the train. Inside, he finds it luxurious and quickly makes his way through to the engine, where he finds the spike that was used to kill Isambard, but it's missing its mechanical heart. He places the dynamite by the boiler and lights a long fuse. The train starts to move. He begins running back through the train only to meet Isambard in the dining carriage. The old man confronts him and says he knows his intention. He opens his shirt and shows the hole in his chest with the mechanical heart beating within. From behind, the ghost boy, who is now solid, is carrying the satchel of dynamite and says, "I stopped him, father. I removed the fuse." They talk briefly about how Isambard wanted to spend time with his dead son as much as Robert wanted to be with his missing wife. Isambard says they're alike, but Robert disagrees. He grabs the satchel, throws it open, and slams a burning oil lamp into the bag, causing a huge explosion. This brings us to our reversal. Stevenson and Julia see a huge ghostly explosion a mile or so along the tracks. They run their horses to find train fragments slowly evaporating into green mist. Stevenson uses the compass to find Isambard's slowly evaporating body, and as he vanishes, the clockwork heart falls from him and is taken by Stevenson. And then finally we have our conclusion, a way to say goodbye to the characters. As Julia walks the wreckage, she sees Robert standing as a ghost. As he is fading away, she asks if he found his wife. He confesses he didn't and never would, as she was gone forever. In his final moments, he confesses that the greatest mistake he ever made was not heeding her advice to try and love again with the living instead of searching for lost love of his wife. And Robert fades away, leaving Julia alone. I decided to add on an epilogue just as a way to really close it out. That back at the Temple of Other, Stevenson replaces the compass and mechanical heart back into its box and has the box returned to a vault that looks like a museum of parapsychology, supernatural and the unnatural. So we now have our story. We have from beginning to end. If you think, it wasn't that long ago we were looking at a blank sheet of paper and trying to generate ideas to see what worked and what didn't work. But now we've got to a point where we have a complete story. Before we can begin writing, we need to create a scene list. This will make sure that we never have writer's block. And that's what we'll look at in the next episode. So until then, keep working on your stories, and we'll see you real soon.